Some years ago, I watched an interview on television with a Japanese kamikaze pilot who survived the war. He did, in fact, fly his kamikaze mission, and the war ended. He was a young man then, and he lived to be a very old man. He was being interviewed toward the end of his life about how relieved he must have felt that the war came to an end, and he didn't have to fly his kamikaze mission. And when the interviewer said this, the man replied in a very strange way. He said, relieved. He said, on the contrary, it was the greatest dishonor of my life. And it then hit me that here's a guy who actually felt bad that he wasn't able to die as a martyr, that he wasn't able to fly his plane into an Allied ship. Now, all of this came flashing back to my mind following a controversy involving Nikole Hannah Jones of the 1619 Project. She's talking about the fact that she felt so bad when she went to the Hiroshima Museum at the US dropping the bomb on Hiroshima. And I've mentioned that before in the podcast, but I didn't discuss the actual controversy itself. I simply discussed the fact that Nikole Hannah Jones is playing with the politics of shame, which is an important strategy of the critical race theory movement, to manipulate shame and to cultivate, you may say, bogus shame, and to pretend on the parts of these people that they feel shame when they really don't. But some people, on social media, challenged Nikole Hannah Jones and said, well, it's very easy to say with the benefit of hindsight, someone who has actually never served in war, very easy for you to say that dropping the bomb was such a bad idea because dropping the bomb prevented the US invasion of Japan. To which Nikole Hannah Jones replies this, quote, "You're the one who poorly understands history. They dropped the bomb when they knew surrender was coming because they'd spent all this money developing and to prove it was worth it. Propaganda is not history, my friend." So here's what Nikole Hannah Jones is saying. Number one, the US knew beforehand that the Japanese were about to surrender, but dropped the bomb on them anyway. The motive for dropping the bomb is we spent money to build the bomb and we kind of wanted to, show that money was worth it. So that's why we dropped it. It was a purely, deeply cynical and morally horrific, if true. And third, she's backing up and making her general point, propaganda is not history. Now, a number of scholars have jumped in to say to Nikole Hannah Jones, listen, to this day, historians debate the morality and the justification for dropping the bomb. And I want to turn to someone who was, you may say, directly involved. This is the writer Paul Fussell in an important book, an essay called Thank God for the Atom Bomb. And Paul Fussell says, first of all, that no one knew that surrender was coming. He goes, the Japanese were not about to surrender. In fact, he says that the Japanese had gotten ready 10,000 kamikaze planes and were talking about arming every Japanese citizen, including arming children and grandmothers with spears and pikes to fight the Americans when they showed up in Japan. He says even the first bomb didn't do it. The Japanese were still talking about fighting to the last man until the second bomb dropped in Nagasaki. So in other words, it took not one, but two bombs to bring about the Japanese surrender. Moreover, Paul Fussell says that this idea of the US invasion of Japan wasn't some kind of a theoretical idea like we might ultimately have to invade Japan. He says the US was on the verge of invading Japan. He says the US had planned the invasion. The invasion was imminent. It was an infantry assault on the island of Kyushu. 13 divisions were going to land there in November of 1945. And then Honshu, 16 divisions were scheduled for March of 1946. The US had planned for a full 1 year of fighting on the Japanese mainland itself. And the estimated number of casualties expected, 1 million casualties. Now, the United States in July of 1945, in preparation for the invasion, had moved the battleships Iowa, the Missouri, the Wisconsin, and the King George V up and down the Japanese coast and had already begun the shelling of Japan in preparation for the invasion. And finally, this crusher, he says, the invasion was definitely on. This is Paul Fussell writing, as I know, because I was going to be in it. He goes, My division was to take place in the invasion of Honshu. I was a 21-year-old second lieutenant of infantry leading a rifle platoon. And then he says, when the news came that the atomic bombs had dropped, he goes, despite the practiced tough facades, he's talking about the soldiers and himself, he goes, we broke down and cried with relief and joy. The killing was going to be over. We were going to grow to adulthood after all. So Paul Fussel's point is from the point of view of someone whose own life was at stake. Thank God for the atom bomb. In fact, he concludes his essay by saying, experience tells us that the pity is not that we used the bomb to end the Japanese war, but that we didn't have it to end the German war. He goes, think about it. What if we were able to drop a bomb on the Nazi leadership? Quote, much of the Nazi hierarchy could have been pulverized immediately, and the lives of millions of Jews, Poles, Slavs, and Gypsies, not to mention the lives and limbs of millions of Allied and German soldiers, could have been saved. This is something that is utterly outside the reach of Nikole Hannah Jones. In her case, it's a combination of malice and stupidity. And the great irony is that you've got someone who's a journalist who doesn't even have any feel for war, doesn't even know the history surrounding this debate, pontificating and making the point that, quote, propaganda is not history, even though she herself is peddling straight out propaganda.